Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Richard M. Nixon once advised a young Donald Rumsfeld that he could develop superb international credentials while systematically ignoring Latin America. Unfortunately, the president's advice was as astute as it was cynical. American attention to the region has been largely episodic and most often linked to perceived dangers like missiles in Cuba or drugs crossing the border. Lacking the economic potential of Asia or the heartbreaking disorder of Africa, Latin America does not engage American policy architects with the serious and sustained attention it deserves. What's being overlooked is an undramatic but sustained democratic evolution as many Latin societies approach long-dreamt-of economic and political stability. This process, however, is fragile and fitful, and the ancient enemies of corruption and inequality have yet to be vanquished. Yet this does seem to be a moment when the tide of democratic aspiration can be seized at its crest, and opportunities exist for imaginative new overtures to a region of rare promise. My guest is Michael Reid, author of Forgotten Continent, The Battle for Latin America's Soul. Welcome to Dialogue, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Let me hold up your fine book, which is also, I must point out, now available in paperback as well. And a fine book it is. I've read it. It's easy to read, but it is absolutely full of information that is extremely useful to the policymaker and the general reader alike. My first question, Michael, actually comes from the title itself. Let's focus on the word forgotten. Forgotten here, I think, alludes to the world's lack of attention to a region of vital importance. I want to turn that around, if I may, in the first question and ask you, because I agree with that part, has there been any kind of corresponding disinterest on the part of Latin America toward the world? And I ask that for this reason. It's always struck me, as one who's been very close to the region, as a region that always has punched below its weight in world councils. You rarely see, until recently, with Brazil as a peacemaker here and there, and of course making its presence known on the global stage. But in world councils and in world disasters and world events, generally speaking, Latin America has always struck me as the absent partner.
I think that's a fair comment, and I think it perhaps dates back to actually, and interestingly, perhaps to the experience of the region in the Depression. I mean, after the Wall Street crash, I mean, Latin America had been quite engaged in the world economy in the previous period of globalization, and then was hit badly by the Depression, and many countries turned inwards in terms of economic policy and pursued import substitution and what was known as desarrollo para adentro, inward-looking development. And I think that spilled over into the politics as well, to a certain extent. I do think that's changed over the past a couple of decades, and particularly we now see Brazil and Mexico, because of their size and the weight of their economies, taking part in global discussions. I mean, I think there's still a way to go before the region develops a clear agenda of what it wants out of those discussions. And the other part of the title of the book, The Battle for Latin America's Soul, refers to the fact that at the moment there's an argument within the region about what its relationship with the rest of the world should be.
Very interesting.
And you have some leaders, I mean, this tendency personified obviously by Hugo Chavez, who have kind of resurrected dependency theory, the idea that Latin America's problems come from the outside world, and the solutions lie within. Whereas the other part of the region, and the bigger, and I would say more successful part of the region, recognizes that a prosperous future lies from connection to the rest of the world.
Now, if that larger, more prosperous part of the region prevails in this argument that you so helpfully point out for us, and I had not known the roots to the sort of preceding attitude lay in the Depression. That's very interesting. But if this argument to how we're going to engage the world prevails, what would that mean for the world? Because I think one of the premises of this book is that the region, Latin America, and particularly its democratic reformist agenda, is something of a laboratory for capitalist democracy. You use that phrase comes through, and so that presumably might have resonance beyond the region itself.
Yes, that's one of the main arguments of the book, that by overlooking what's happening in Latin America, people who follow the world, be it here in the United States or in Europe or in Asia, are missing out on something. And that is that Latin America, on the one hand, is now one of the three great regions of democracy, along with Europe and North America, or English and French-speaking North America. But it's trying to make democracy work in a context historically derived of extreme inequality of income, wealth, and historically of political power, and therefore of considerable poverty, although these are middle-income countries. So Latin America is trying to make democracy work to overcome those problems. And I think the viability of democracy as a project in developing countries is being tested here. One sees it most obviously in social policy, that some of the social policies pioneered by Latin American countries, such as conditional cash transfers, these schemes that pay small amounts of money to poor families, to the women, provided that they keep their children in school and take them for regular health checkups, with the idea of ameliorating poverty in this generation, but overcoming it in the next generation, so that the children will be better schooled and in better health. Those programs have been copied in countries in the Middle East, in Asia, and indeed in New York City.
I had not known, well, I did not know any of that.
And I think the same kind of thing applies in several other fields. I mean, I think, for example, in relation to the environment, I mean, Latin America is very vulnerable to climate change, but it's also got some of the world's richest and most biodiverse natural environments.
Well, what you're saying is this is a continent we can learn from.
I think so. I think so.
You know, another of the central themes, if I may say so, of this book, in fact, it's right on the cover. If you look at it, and I think the cover is extremely evocative. I'll hold it up one more time here. We have a very vibrant Latin American metropolis. I bet it's Sao Paulo.
It is.
I win the bet. And of course, and a very vibrant Hugo Chavez here at the bottom. And these seems to symbolize the two of the, well, the main argument you seem to be making is that it's the kind of populist autocracy that Mr. Chavez represents as one theme in Latin America that's in contest with the democratic reformist trend. I think you've said earlier, Michael, you said consistently, and certainly the argument here is that the democratic reformist theme is winning out, or at least it seems to be ascendant.
I think it is, although in an underlying way, it's not necessarily the most voluble current. I think it will be tested by the current world recession, clearly, and things are going to be difficult in the region, as they are in the rest of the world for the next year or two. But I suspect they're going to be more difficult for countries such as Venezuela, that have not used wisely the bonanza from high commodity prices in the last few years, and that have antagonized and alienated and driven away the private sector and private investment.
Which leads to my principal question about the populist school as represented particularly by Mr. Chavez. I perhaps shouldn't defame the entire philosophy, but Mr. Chavez in particular is poster child of it in some degree, but of course he's very much a unique figure, I think. My question is, how far does his appeal really reach? I mean, what's the possible impact and effectiveness of Hugo Chavez? Now, I'll be blunt about it. I personally, following what he says and does, which is extremely provocative. The other day he's called our president an ignoramus, I believe, and there's an insult, obviously, in that, directly in that. But that seems to be his role, agent provocateur. I don't see where beyond that kind of thing Hugo Chavez really goes, and everything that he seems to have done or put forth as his accomplishment has depended upon the price of oil, and
Absolutely.
It's fluctuated as that price has fluctuated.
I think one has to give him credit for a remarkable talent for communication and empathy with poorer Venezuelans.
Right.
And he's quite cunning as a political leader. But as you say, the rise of Chavez in Venezuela, or at least the rise of Chavismo in Latin America, owes everything to the oil price, which went up massively when he came into power a decade ago. Venezuelan oil was getting about $10 a barrel, and then of course it went up to close to 150, and now it's come down again. I think his influence in the region is past its peak. I think one has to say that some of his allies, such as Evo Morales in Bolivia or Rafael Correa in Ecuador, came to power mainly because of internal political processes in their own countries, and they have their own logic or lack of it. The political processes in those countries. Clearly, one element in both Bolivia and Ecuador is the rise of ethnic politics,
indigenous,
the replacement of class politics with that of ethnic identity,
right.
Which is based partly on the fact that there's a structural problem of racial discrimination. But we'll see whether that leads to a better solution to that problem or not.
Yeah. One of the most remarkable revelations in this book for me, Michael, I hope I'm going to strive to get this right, because you're well known to everyone watching us as for your role at The Economist and your coverage of the region for so many years, and not just The Economist magazine, but your own smarts as an economist, to put it that way. I don't have them. I don't really understand economics very well. But I do understand that the democratic reformist movement we're talking about has its roots in economic success, it would seem to me. That is what undergirds it, the fact that the region has been able over the past 2 years to attain greater stability in its macroeconomic profile. And what strikes me as particularly interesting about that, if I understood it correctly from the book, is that it was, in the first instance, something called the Washington Consensus, which gave the open market strategy its beginnings in Latin America, so to speak. But it was, and this is really the thing that I want you to make sure I got right, the Pinochet government in Chile, a government, of course, was completely undemocratic, that really made those reforms work. And even when the Washington Consensus itself became discredited, the principles that it served, by which it operated, became so embedded and so successful that they in turn have given rise to their adaptation elsewhere in the region. Is that right?
I put it in a slightly more nuanced way in the book, but I think it's an uncomfortable fact for Democrats that the basis of Chile's economic success of recent years was laid by the Pinochet regime. But as I point out in the book, it did so through a very costly process of trial and error, in which it paid almost no heed at first to the social costs of what it was doing. I mean, in 1982, that's 9 years after Pinochet's coup, Chile was the country that suffered most in the regional debt crisis because of policy mistakes, which were really rather similar to those that we hear so much about now in terms of irresponsible lending by banks and things like that. Yes, I mean, I think that, to cut a long story short, I think what we've seen in the region in the last few years is countries, governments building on the good things in the Washington Consensus, which were the recognition of the importance of open market economies and free trade and openness to investment and economic stability, low inflation, and supplementing that with a recognition of the essential role of the state in education, health, social policy, in fighting poverty, in development in general, and that includes promoting innovation and research and development and so forth. And so I think you have a new tacit consensus that takes the best things out of the Washington Consensus and adds more centrist social democratic elements.
Is this irreversible? Maybe a very dangerous word to use, but so I won't use it. But does this strike you as a long-term development? I mean, how fragile is it, this consensus, or how strong is it?
No, I don't think it's irreversible. I mean, because as long as you have such high levels of inequality and poverty, though they are coming down in several countries, notably in Brazil, but poverty has come down quite significantly in many other countries. But as long as there are such high levels of inequality and poverty, then I think the populist temptation is there. I do think the region will be tested by this recession. I think it's important to point out that for the first time in a long time, this is a crisis whose origin comes from outside the region. Now, that doesn't make it any less painful if you lose your job in Latin America. But it does mean that the fault is not that the region was doing things wrong in policy terms.
You're quite right. We're all being tested, in Latin America no less than any other region. But I was struck by something on this, Michael, when President Lula of Brazil was here most recently with President Obama. And it was very interesting just to watch the dynamics of the two men talking and the reports of their conversations. But what I found particularly novel in a way and interesting was that Brazil was speaking from a position of strength. That even in this, at least in the current moment, this may be a day-by-day sort of phenomena here, that Brazil has a lot of strength, internal strength, with which to meet this current economic challenge, or at least it seems to believe it does, which is almost as good as the real thing.
Yes, I mean, for the first time, several countries in the region have been able to undertake counter-cyclical policies. I mean, in the past, when the economy turned down, they had to cut public spending. Several of them have been able to increase public spending, and similarly lower interest rates. Now, I mean, more broadly, I mean, going back to the title, I say in the book that neglect is often benign, and that at the end of the day, countries have to make their own effort to develop. And I think a lot of that's gone on in the past few decades. And this combination of democracy, economic stability with low inflation, and openness does provide a sound base for countries to weather this period. But clearly some things will be rethought.
Yeah. Even as these countries weather this period, as they certainly must do so, we must certainly try to do so, it does seem to me, Michael, that, and even in the face of all the advances and the very positive trends you point out, and one of the strengths of this book, quite frankly, is that most times when I've read things about Latin America, and either the popular or academic press, it's been almost about the pathologies of the region. You know, how cursed the place is, how, you know, you almost want to just throw up your hands in despair. But this book has a very, very different message about the region. And yet, and this is my question, it seems to me that, and let me name them, it's like the three horsemen of the apocalypse here. Crime, inequality, and rampant political corruption. These remain, I think, the main bugaboos or the main problems that they're going to have to wrestle with to fully accomplish goals.
I would add, and I do add in the book, the low quality of education.
Exactly, you do.
And insufficient coverage. But I mean, you're right. I do think that there's been far more progress in the region than is commonly accepted, and I think it's important to recognise that progress because it is the fruit of democracy and more sensible economic policies. Yeah. And the idea that everything is a disaster leads people to want to constantly tear up everything that's there and start again. And actually, I think that the way to tackle these problems that you mentioned is about gradually building stronger institutions, building political consensuses, and not seeking miracle solutions which aren't there.
That's exactly right. And in fact, building stronger institutions is a major point of this book. That's a task yet to be filled. And I must give you full credit on this. Not only do you mention, or not just mention, but discuss education and its importance, I think you present it as kind of one of the basic solutions that must be presented. It reminded me, I once talked to Jeffrey Sachs about World Health, and he said, you know, if governments did more in the way of sanitation, you'd conquer a lot of health issues. And I think your argument is somewhat similar. If you get education on a more equal and comprehensive basis for all, as opposed to just a kind of a feature of the privileged classes, you will do much more for stability in the long run.
Yeah, because I think you do more for economic growth because you raise productivity, but also you do more for equity, for equality of opportunity, and that means. I mean, a big effort has been made in the last 15 or 20 years to improve, to expand the coverage of education in Latin America, so that primary schooling is now, for all practical purposes, universal in nearly every country. And there's still a bit of a way to go on secondary education, but its coverage has increased a lot, and as indeed has university education expanded. But the key challenge is to improve the quality of public schooling. And children in public schools in Latin America are just not being taught well enough. And that's partly to do with lack of funds, but it's more to do with the poor organization and the wrong incentives at school level. I mean, you need to have better trained teachers. You need to have, I think, more accountable schools, right. And more local accountability combined with rigorous national evaluation and inspection.
What country, if any, is closer to the...
I think the interesting thing that is that in the last few years, I mean, the 1980s and 1990s, public debate in Latin America was all about economic crisis, inflation, and big ideological questions of, you know, do we want a socialist government? Do we want a revolution? Do we want to be part of the world or not? I think in the last few years, in many countries, there has at least been a big public debate about education, and you're starting to see a series of small initiatives in several countries, in Mexico, Chile, states in Brazil, Sao Paulo, for example, to make schools better.
You know, the very progress of that kind of evolution from big ideological arguments to these more tactical, if you will, discussions of what will make our society better for our children, for the rest of us as well. That strikes me as really stability. I mean, that's the picture societies when they feel comfortable with where they are.
I think so, and it shows that democracy is gradually taking root, and it is a gradual process, and that's why I think people often miss it when they look at the region.
As we come near to the end of our conversation, Michael, I want to toss a couple of international sort of questions into this. Would the region be advantaged, or that's almost one I can answer myself, but is it the right time, and should the world community now recognize Latin America's role in this world and these kinds of developments by greater prominence for Latin American world councils? I'm thinking specifically of Brazil, the United Nations, the Security Council, that kind of thing. I mean, isn't that the kind of thing that might help also?
I do think certainly that the United Nations Security Council needs to reflect the world as it is today, and not as it was in 1945. And if it were to reflect the world as it is today, I think that Brazil deserves a place on it. Though, of course, some of those who are uneasy about that include Argentina and Mexico, but
Nigeria
and then
India.
You repeat the story for other continents, but. I think the other thing that we've seen in the last few months is the emergence of the G20, which has 3 Latin American members. And the G20, one can argue about individual countries, whether they should or shouldn't be there. But it clearly reflects the world economy as it is more accurately than the G7 did. But I think it's also up to Latin America and Latin Americans to claim that place in the world that you're talking about.
I completely agree, and I completely agree with so much that's in this marvelous book. I thank you for writing it. I'm so glad it's in paperback so that everyone can read it. And thank you for being a guest on our program.
Thank you very much, George. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure, Michael.
Thanks.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhzworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Michael, Reid, thank you again. Really marvelous discussion.
Thank you.